Canadian football is a magic show, a century-old spectacle, grown men battling to cross a line drawn in the dirt. It is a game filled with heroes, great players and great teams, bringing championship pride to their faithful fans. The field is a battleground where skill and determination are the tools of the trade. It is a game that has grabbed the nation by the heart. An annual struggle becomes an epic battle as teams fight for the ultimate glory, the chance to hold the Grey Cup and become forever known as a champion. Canadian football was born in the mid-1800s, a child of rugby reshaped by robust young men off on a new world adventure. The version they devised, rougher, tougher, bloodier, found a home on university athletic fields where the student body became the game's first fans. But this wonderful new game was strictly a Canadian phenomenon until a fateful weekend in 1874 when the men of McGill University accepted an invitation to play 2 matches at Harvard and found the Americans playing a different game entirely, an offshoot of soccer containing little of the rough and tumble chaos now so dear to the Canadians' hearts.
They played 1 game under the Canadian rules, under McGill's rules, 1 game under the Harvard rules. In the end, Harvard enjoyed the type of football that McGill brought so much that they wrote away to rugby school in England and they got the official rugby rules.
The game of the North was now a cross-border phenomenon. Soon, it spilled over the campuses and into the cities, then west with the settlers. No longer merely the sport of the educated elite, it became the game of the working masses. Teams sprang out of meetings held in rooms over grocery stores, in mechanics halls and rowing clubs. Bankers bashed ironworkers. Lawyers took their lumps from lumberjacks. Leagues were born, collapsed, and rose again. A new country had a new game and new heroes. By the turn of the century, football had been embraced by athletes of all ages and from all walks of life, competing for trophies of every shape and size. In 1909, word of this new game caught the attention of Albert Henry George Grey, the 4th Earl Grey and the Governor-General of Canada. Well-known patrons of Canadian arts, the Earl and his wife decided that the new game should have a true national championship. At a cost of $48, Lord Grey provided a simple silver trophy that would one day be the stuff of dreams, the Grey Cup.
The cup was donated by the Governor-General, Lord Earl Grey, who probably never saw a game played. He put up the trophy for the Amateur Football Championship of Canada, and people who were playing football in all parts of Canada saw it as emblematic of the national championship.
The first Grey Cup game was held on a chilly December Saturday in 1909. 3,800 fans made the trek to Rosedale Field to watch the University of Toronto defeat the Parkdale Canoe Club in what was rather grandly called the Canadian Championship. But Lord Grey's trophy wasn't there. Someone had forgotten to have it engraved. The games then were simple gatherings, young and not so young athletes out for a rough and tumble afternoon. But soon, Earl Grey's Cup was more than just another trophy. As the decades passed and the number of challengers grew, it would become the new game's Holy Grail. In the 1940s, not even a world in conflict could halt the yearly quest. When Canada went to war, enlisted men formed teams and battled for the Cup under military banners. Through rain, fog, mud, or the chill of Canadian winter, the Cup chase never faltered. Now, the pursuers wanted more than the championship. They wanted that magical, matchless moment when they could grasp Earl Grey's Cup and triumphantly hold it high.
When you win the Grey Cup, you know, you're on such a high because you've accomplished what 9 teams start out to do and only 1 does.
What it meant to the city of Winnipeg and the fans, that's when it starts sinking in of just how important the Grey Cup is and what it means to the people of Canada.
It really didn't hit you till a few days later, and you know, when you get back in Edmonton and you're going to the parade and say, hey, this is kind of a big deal.
The city of Vancouver, on our return, just opened their arms to us. A marvelous thing and very special. There was love here for the BC Lions.
20 below weather, the streets were lined all the way from the airport entrance to City Hall, where they took us back to on buses, and the town just went nuts.
Every team sets out and you want to win the championship. Win the championship. That is a successful season. Anything else isn't successful.
It didn't really hit me after the game. It hit me the next year, seeing that this trophy is going to be forever. Your name's going to be a part of it, and you're going to be associated with the Grey Cup winning team.
Canadian football's eastern roots gave this rugged game at least a touch of refinement. Out west, settlers toughened by hardship and prairie winters reveled in their own bone-crushing version, fought with a ferocity and abandon that turned a simple game into a no-quarter battle.
They just threw money into the pot, and the first one that drew blood got the money. There were a lot of broken bones and broken noses and front teeth missing and that kind of thing. In the first game, Regina played against Saskatoon. Up in Saskatoon, the police chief was so upset with the fact that the Regina team was winning, and he thought they were playing too rough against the Saskatoon boys, that he came on the field and had the Regina team arrested.
In spite of the potential for injury or arrest, football thrived on the Canadian prairie. The Hamilton Tigers became the first team to journey west, playing exhibition games in Winnipeg, Moose Jaw, Regina, and Calgary. While Eastern teams were happy to share the game with the West, sharing their championship trophy was another matter.
Only Eastern teams would play for the Grey Cup, and in 1911, the Calgary Tigers won the championship of the West, and they challenged. They wanted to play in the Grey Cup, and the CRU wouldn't let them. They would turn them down. They said, you didn't play in the East, you can't play challenge for the Grey Cup.
Finally, with great reluctance, the Edmonton Eskimos were allowed to come east in 1921 to challenge Toronto for the right to sip from the Earl's silvered mug. Their timing couldn't have been worse. They ran head-on to the man known as the Big Train, Lionel Conacher.
They ended up losing 23-0 in that game. Conacher, as a matter of fact, scored 15 points, and halfway through the third quarter had to leave because he had a hockey game that night.
Hockey and football were just two of the many sports on the Conacher resume, all played so brilliantly that he was named Canada's Athlete of the Half-Century. Since 1921, Western teams had marched east for the Grey Cup game, only to fall to the Eastern football powerhouses. In desperation, they cast their eyes not to the heavens, but to the south.
We didn't have the population in the West that they had in the East, so in order to get enough guys, it was we had to supplement them with good, experienced American players from American colleges. And of course, the first, most successful of those teams was the Winnipeg team in 1935.
Winnipeg coach Joe Ryan took a fishing trip to Minnesota and North Dakota that fateful summer of 1935. His bait, money, and he landed his limit. For $7,400, he came home with 9 imports, including the West's first superstar, the incomparable Fritzie Hansen. With Fritzie carrying the mail, the Bombers romped through the West and into the Grey Cup game, where on a muddy field in Hamilton, stunned Easterners got their first look at the little big man from Minnesota.
Fritzie Hansen was an import for Winnipeg, and he was one of these scatbacks that could dangle, and he caught a couple of kicks and ran right through the whole team because nobody had any traction. He had the whole field to himself, and he made the game look easy for Winnipeg, and he made a great name for himself.
In Fritzie and Friends, the Canadian Rugby Union did not see players of great skill. They saw a threat to the very game itself, with teams buying championships and Americans shoving local boys off the roster. Their solution: change the rules.
The CRU decided that they didn't want these American imports coming in specifically to win a competition. So they passed what was called a one-year residency rule. And they said that any American playing in the Grey Cup game had to be in the country for at least 1 year prior to the game.
American imports were now a fact of Canadian football life. Although their numbers increased with the years, they did not destroy the game as the CRU had so darkly predicted. They enhanced it. The Northern League thrived, an alliance that continues to bring great American players to a game that remains distinctly Canadian.
There's something about the Canadian Football League in Canada. It's got a tremendous history about it when you go back and look at some of the great people that have come up here and lived in this country, and they got the opportunity to play. I mean, this is what the game's all about.
It was an opportunity that I was being given that I didn't see happening in my own country, and I really weighed the pros and cons of going to Canada or staying in the United States, and I chose to go to Canada because they were giving me a realistic opportunity to play the game that I love.
I wanted to come play. In the NFL, they would have just used me for, okay, for this and for that. And in Edmonton, I knew I had a chance to do what I wanted to do and play the game.
It put the fun back in football for me. It enabled me to go back out, just be an athlete, play football, and enjoy it. And I'll be forever grateful for that.
During the Depression, there was seldom a penny to spare for children's games. But kids who longed to play football could always find a way.
Nobody had a football, so we'd take somebody's cap, you know the old caps that the kids used to wear, you'll see them in pictures, and stuff it with padding, and so we have no kicking game, so it's a running game only. And that's how we got started.
All our footballs were homemade. We couldn't afford a football. Well, I had something made like a football, made out of a sack or some stuff, sack or a pig's bladder or something like that. But the only time that I ever touched a real football is when I went to high school.
But young boys become young men, and there are real footballs to be thrown and real games to be played. As a pastime becomes a passion, a game becomes a way of life. Though the stakes grow higher and the win's more important, it all comes down to a simple love of the game.
Canadian football was plain, old-fashioned mayhem. You played it, in my day, you played it because you loved the game.
The players didn't make any money. And so they all held jobs. Stukas worked for the Star. And as a football writer, well, at the time he was playing, which he certainly gave himself the benefit of the doubt in his stories, Stukas tells the story of playing for the Argonauts when they won the Grey Cup, I think it was 1938, and all he got for it was a windbreaker. He says a really nice windbreaker.
Though the players weren't making any money, they could see by the crowds paying their way into the parks that someone was. They decided it was time they got a piece of the pie. The man the Toronto Argonauts picked to plead their case, Ennis Stukas. Management was quick to respond.
How dare this goddamn football player ask for money? We let them play. We give them great uniforms. We go to the best hotels when we go out of towns. Holy mackerel, and now the guy wants money?
Playing football in Canada was an uncertain profession at best, but the harsh Canadian winter was a virtual guarantee.
I used to die in the cold because you have the lighter uniforms on, so every time you hit the ground, you took a chunk out of your hide. You literally did take a chunk out of your body. And the most painful thing I had to do that day was take a shower. It was so painful to get in that water.
In our first game, the referee had to stand under the goalpost. It was snowing so hard to see if the ball was going through on field goals and extra points. And I'm saying, what did I get myself into here? I'm cold.
Football was a daylight game. If dusk fell before the final gun, finishing the contest required a little help from the crowd.
Fans were urged to park their cars along the sidelines because if the game got going too long, then what would happen was that they'd turn the lights on from their cars and play it out that particular way.
We were playing a game in Ottawa, and we played the last 10 minutes of that game, or 5 minutes of that game, under headlights. They got the people to turn their headlights on in the cars, and that's how we finished the game.
By the 1930s, football had been in Canada for better than a half century, and still the game looked a lot like rugby. The forward pass had found its way into the rule book, but not everyone cared or dared to use it.
The kicking was the essence of the game. What the guys did is that they punted the ball and then ran down underneath it. As the forward pass came in around 1930, there were different rules. For example, if a pass was incomplete, it was a fumble, and so it was used very judiciously.
The man who changed all that was Warren Stevens. In 1931, he threw the Grey Cup's first touchdown pass in Montreal's 22-0 win over Regina. But change requires time. While the forward pass could be a quick and devastating weapon when successful, throwing the ball was still no simple matter.
To be honest with you, we didn't throw that many passes as they do today. The darn balls, they were almost like a soccer ball. It was very difficult to grab a hold of the darn thing, so you laid it on the palm of your hand and threw it. In other words, you didn't grip it.
Well, the ball we used was relatively primitive because it wasn't dimpled to enable the quarterback to grasp it easier. And when I look at it, I can't believe the size and the shape compared to how it is today.
Pass, run, or kick, the name of the game was hitting, and the padding offered little protection.
The equipment I used, people would laugh at. What you got when you went up with the big team was secondhand furniture. At training camp, the new guys coming in took old-timers' equipment from a year, 2 years past. And if the shoes were a size too big, tough luck, wear them.
The post-war years were a boom time for Canadian football. In 1948, The Calgary Stampeders galloped through the three-team West as they recorded the only undefeated season in league history. Heading east, the 4-day train trip became a traveling party as the Stampeders made the cross-country trek to the Grey Cup game. Arriving with Stetson-topped fans, Indian chiefs, chuck wagons, and horses, the Stampeders didn't just come from the West, they brought the West with them.
The 1948 Grey Cup game was pivotal in turning a celebration into a national festival. The Calgary Stampeders brought their chuck wagons, loaded them on the train. They had flapjack breakfasts. They had horses parading through hotel lobbies. It gave it another dimension. And from that time on, I think almost every Grey Cup game has been measured by what happened in 1948.
The Stampeders did more than defeat the Ottawa Rough Riders 12-7. Their victory and their fans' Western exuberance turned a 3-hour showdown into a week-long hoedown, and the party has never stopped. Grey Cup Day has become Grey Cup Week. A game once of regional interest is now a national obsession. And so, the story of the modern-day CFL begins. It is the story of a league often battered but never down, of a game that is an important thread in the Canadian cultural fabric, a game that is ours and ours alone.
Canadian football is something I was brought up on. I love the game because it's quick. It has always allowed the quarterback to be able to run with the ball, and I thoroughly enjoyed that challenge.
The excitement in the game, in a Canadian football game, with the 3 downs, with the wider field, with the kick return, it may be the best game in the world to watch on television.
It's so fast, it's so wide open, and I think it speaks to my personality. It's sort of a living on the edge type of football game.
It's exciting. You're never out of a ball game in the Canadian Football League. And as a quarterback, that's all you want is a chance. You want to have the ball in your hands with 1 minute to play and give your team a chance to win the ball game.
The Canadian Football League is arguably the most significant cultural institution in the country as it relates to bringing cities across the country together.
It's the one thing, the one professional sport that we have left that we can say is purely Canadian. It's the only one.
Canadian football is a magic show, a century-old spectacle, grown men battling to cross a line drawn in the dirt. It is a game filled with heroes, great players and great teams, bringing championship pride to their faithful fans. The field is a battleground where skill and determination are the tools of the trade. It is a game that has grabbed the nation by the heart. An annual struggle becomes an epic battle as teams fight for the ultimate glory, the chance to hold the Grey Cup and become forever known as a champion. In 1867, Canada became a country, and Ottawa had its first football game. Although the game was only a few years old, it was an instant hit, and teams sprung up across the nation's capital. In 1925 and 26, it was the Senators who brought Ottawa Grey Cup championships, and in 1940, the Rough Riders captured the only Grey Cup final to be decided in a two-game total point series. 11 years later, at Toronto's Varsity Stadium, the Rough Riders faced their namesakes from Saskatchewan. That day, it was the Eastern Riders who rode to victory as they brought Ottawa a fourth Grey Cup championship. Through the 50s, Rough Riders football was the top game in town, and Ottawa's Lansdowne Park was the place to be.
Lansdowne Park in the early 50s only held about maybe 12,000. It was an old steel girder type of park, and on the opposite side near the canal, they didn't have any stands in those days. People would park in their cars there and stand kind of on the sidelines, and I think a good crowd for us in those days was about 10,000. We'd have about 9 in the grandstand and maybe another 1,000 hanging around the sideline.
While the crowds filled Lansdowne Park, they saw little on-field success. Then, in 1956, the Riders signed the scholarly-looking Frank Clare, a coach who'd won 2 Grey Cups with the Toronto Argonauts.
Frank Clare, first of all, was one of the greatest coaches ever in the league. The guy was really, really bright. And the thing that I like so well about him, he had just a little bit of a different slant on football. It was speed, quickness, high athletic skills out of quarterbacks and running backs and receivers.
In Ottawa, Clare found a player who was a perfect fit for his high-skill, high-speed offense, all-purpose all-star Bobby Simpson.
Bobby had hands like dinner plates. He could catch anything that was thrown anywhere near to him. He was a leader. He'd play quarterback. He'd do anything.
Bobby was the spokesman for the team on and off the field, and he was just a great character, beside being a great football player. And I think that, Bobby was the Ottawa Rough Riders for many years.
Coach Frank Clare had been brought in to turn the Rough Riders into a winning team. And while they did begin to show signs of improvement, the turning point came in 1958 with the signing of a Canadian from McMaster University, Russell Stanley Jackson.
When I first went to Ottawa and went there out of McMaster University, I did not go there with the idea of making the team as a starting quarterback or anything like that. I made it as a defensive back. I got put into the job as quarterback because of injuries, and I was in the right place at the right time because they were running an offense that Russ Jackson knew how to run to a T, because I'd run it all through university.
As a quarterback, Jackson was a constant threat, with both outstanding speed and a powerful arm. And when he needed help to move the ball, he turned to a player who still holds the CFL single-game rushing record, running back Ron Stewart.
When we looked at him, here comes a little fire plug walking out there, 5'6", 5'7", whatever height he was at the time, and everybody wasn't very impressive looking, but when he got the football under his arm and we got into scrimmages, we found out all about him.
I was always the smallest guy on the field, so you were, everybody kind of looked at you and said, who is this little guy? But I guess when you're shorter than the rest of the people, there is sort of a burning desire to get out there and maybe knock some big guy on his butt just to show them that you can play.
Ron Lancaster joined the Ottawa Rough Riders in 1960. With Russ Jackson already a proven talent, his arrival gave Coach Frank Clare 2 star quarterbacks on the roster.
I really did not know who Russ Jackson was, except that when I got there, I found out he was a starting quarterback. And for some reason or other, my locker was right beside him, so I got to know him very well. And even though we were competitors and we both were young in our careers, we got along very well.
Ronnie and I handled it, I think, as well as you could. We were both young kids. We both wanted to play football. We both desperately wanted to be the starting quarterback, and we didn't know who was going to start the game until after the pregame warm-up. And I found that very difficult to prepare yourself. Like, as a quarterback, it's one of those positions you have to prepare yourself to start the game and have thought through the game plan and so on. But we would get equal number of snaps during the practices at week. No one would get favored to get all the snaps or anything. And we'd lock her beside each other, and Ronnie'd say to me, or I'd say to him, "Do you know when you're starting?" "Nope, hasn't said anything to me."
I can remember many times standing on the sidelines just before kickoff, and Russ would be standing there, and one of us would say to the other one, "Are you starting?" We still didn't know until the ball was kicked off, and we would say then, "Well, yeah, Coach told me I was starting," and that might be the first time you've heard about it. So we got along well, and we were successful.
In the 1960 playoffs, the Ottawa Rough Riders defeated the Toronto Argonauts in a 2-game total points Eastern Final. Having earned a trip to the Grey Cup, the Riders traveled west of Vancouver's Empire Stadium, where they faced the Western champion Edmonton Eskimos. That day, Russ Jackson and Ron Lancaster shared quarterbacking duties as they led the powerful Ottawa attack. But while Jackson and Lancaster were the team's marquee players, a fumble recovery by veteran lineman Kay Vaughn made him the hero of the day.
I'd never scored a point. Not a touchdown, but I'd never scored a point. And, you know, a lineman doesn't get much glory. And this was kind of the crowning achievement of my 18 years in football.
To go out there and beat the favorites, because Edmonton was certainly the favorites. I guess the law of averages was on our side that day, and we managed to win. Now, if we'd gone back and played them again the next day, they might have beaten us. It was that close a game.
In 1963, Ron Lancaster was traded to Saskatchewan, leaving Russ Jackson as the team's #1 quarterback. His primary target became second-year receiver Whit Tucker.
He was my favorite receiver because I knew where he was going to be. You develop a confidence in somebody after a little bit of time, and I knew where Whit was going to be. And he was one of those guys that had that. He looked like he was running full speed with the long stride, but there was still another gear.
We had a great rapport the last 4 or 5 years I played. And we used to stay after practice every night for at least a half an hour and do cuts, throw passes. And so we got to know each other quite well. And he got to trust me, I believe, and I got to trust him.
During the 1966 playoffs, tragedy struck the Ottawa Rough Riders, the sudden death of assistant coach Bill Smith. Arriving in Vancouver for the Grey Cup game, the grief-stricken Ottawa team was unable to match the intensity of Ron Lancaster and the Saskatchewan Rough Riders.
Having gone to the funeral the week of the final games, and having played Hamilton 2 real tough football games to get to the Grey Cup in Vancouver, I think we were emotionally spent. It was a very special time, and it affected all of us.
That was a sad affair. And we went out, and I think we lost a lot of heart over Bill, and that he was so close to all the players, and I think that we let him down that day.
In the late 60s, the Rough Riders had it all: talent, toughness, and an attitude that accepted nothing less than victory.
Ultimate goal every time is to win the championship. That is a successful season. Anything else isn't successful, especially in the CFL with only 9 teams involved. Any team has a chance when they start the season to win that championship.
When we went into a stadium, we knew we could win, and we were a winning team. We had the players for it, and we had the coaches at that time that stress winning. We always stress winning, and we had some key players on offense and defense that could carry us to winning the games and winning the cup.
In 1968, Ottawa stormed through the East and into the Grey Cup against the Calgary Stampeders. In a classic showdown, Russ Jackson led the Rough Riders to a thrilling 24-21 victory over the Western champions.
The '68 Grey Cup team, I believe, is the best team I ever played on, and is one of the best teams ever played in the CFL. We had fantastic athletes, and pound for pound, I think the best team I ever played on, without question.
While the Ottawa Rough Riders celebrated Grey Cup victory, quarterback Russ Jackson had more than football on his mind.
I had told Frank Clare at the beginning of the season, this was my year, this was the year I was going to leave and get on with my career in education, spend more time with my family, and be something other than Russ Jackson, the football player.
In his final Grey Cup battle, Russ Jackson faced former teammate Ron Lancaster and the Saskatchewan Roughriders. He responded in dazzling fashion, throwing a record 4 touchdown passes in a 29-11 victory many consider the outstanding individual performance in Grey Cup history.
We had control of the tempo. The games, you know you have that. We know we can do what we want to do. And there was a, as I say, a calmness about me personally that I don't think I had in any of those other games. Now that calmness disappeared when the final whistle went.
Russ is he was a good football player, and he knew how to play the game, and I don't know if he could have played much better than he did in that particular game. He drove us crazy. He threw for 4 touchdowns, 2 of them to Stewart, and Russ always was a good runner and a competitor, and he was flying that day, and he gave us a lesson.
Grey Cup MVP, 2 Shenley Awards, and the Order of Canada. The perfect farewell for the great Russ Jackson. In 1970, Frank Clare moved to the front office. Jack Goda took his place on the sidelines and put a new stamp on Ottawa football. Its colors, black and blue.
Well, football is a contact sport. And I've always would encourage the guys to have a lot of contact in the game. And the fact that I also had little bonus plans in for extra hard hits on the opposition. and guys loved that. In other words, they just loved the idea that, hey, it's going to be just a little bit better. Let's be a punishing type team. And then the point that I'd always make, hey, especially so because as it gets colder into the end of the season here, when people come into Ottawa to play, I said, really, really, let's knock them cold in the cold.
We didn't have a bunch of good athletes. We had a team that played together and played hard. We had a great defense. So if we scored a couple touchdowns or 1 touchdown or 3 field goals, we'd win the ball game.
Everybody thought they were a dirty team, but they weren't a dirty team. They were a rough, hard-hitting football team, and football is a rough game, and you see people getting hit the way they get hit. You say it's a dirty play, but it's all part of the game. I think they were just a real rough, tough, tumble football team.
Playing with a rugged style that earned them the nickname the Capital Punishment Gang, the Ottawa defense was tough to beat. And Jerry Organ bolstered the offensive attack as he kicked his way to the 1973 league scoring title. That year, the Grey Cup featured an Ottawa-Edmonton matchup. At Toronto's CNE Stadium, Jack Goda unleashed his Capital Punishment Gang on the Western champion Eskimos. Their primary target, quarterback Tom Wilkinson.
That team went after Tom. No matter where he was, they'd hit him. They'd take a 15-yard penalty to get him, to hurt him and get him out of the game. They were a tough group on that side of the line, and they came to play and they went after the quarterback.
They were a very physical team, and that particular year, their defensive end, Wayne Smith, had a cast on his arm to go along with the fact that he was pretty physical anyway. And one of the plays over by the sideline early in the game, he used that cast pretty good on me, and I was a little bit rocky and went out of the game.
With Wilkinson on the sidelines, quarterback Rick Cassetta led Ottawa to a 22-18 triumph, and the Rough Riders celebrated another Grey Cup championship. The victory marked the end of an era for Ottawa. The following season, the team had a new head coach, former Rough Rider defensive back George Brancato.
74 and 75 were, transition years for the Ottawa Football Club. 75, of course, Tommy Clements and Conridge Holloway came into the team, came onto the team, and also a guy named Tony Gabriel, who was, you know, an outstanding player.
Conrad Holloway and Tom Clemens shared the quarterbacking duties, but both understood what they had in former Hamilton star Tony Gabriel, a big target who could make the big catch.
Tony could maneuver really well, and he was such a great competitor, and he could run all day. He was unbelievable, and being the way he was as far as his intelligence and things, how he read coverages and found holes, and the relationship he had between Tommy Clements and Conridge as a receiver, it was just fun to watch him play.
When I went up into the capital city in 1975, being part of the Ottawa Rough Riders, I had no idea how great the fans were. In the South Stands in particular, they were rabid and supportive, and at the same time, win or lose, they came out to watch us play.
In 1976, Tony Gabriel and the Ottawa Rough Riders defeated the Hamilton Tiger Cats in a hard-fought Eastern Final, earning a trip to Toronto to face Ron Lancaster and the Saskatchewan Rough Riders. In a seesaw battle, second-year quarterback Tom Clemens played like a veteran as his team battled back from a 10-point deficit. In the dying seconds of the game, Ottawa still trailed by 4, but everything changed with a Clemens to Gabriel touchdown strike that Ottawa fans still remember as the catch.
I was standing in front of the bench watching the game, and then there goes the pass out to Tony, and I see he's wide open. And in fact, I was running out on the field before he caught the ball because I was going to run down there and catch it for him. He was so wide open.
If you're going to run a last-minute, last-second play, and you're the Ottawa Rough Riders in 1976, with Tom Clements at quarterback and Tony Gabriel as your premier receiver that does everything for you, the ball's probably going to go to him.
Everybody in Canada plus everybody in our bench knew that he's going to Tony Gabriel. And we had a defense designed where we were supposed to double team Gabriel coming off the line. Well, we were in the wrong defense and we couldn't get the double on him. So he gets off the line free and he goes to the corner.
I looked back and I could see that ball just keep coming down my way. And it took so long, but I remember concentrating and watching that ball all the way in.
Final score, 23-20, a dramatic victory for coach George Brancato, and for the Ottawa Rough Riders, a celebration that never grows old, hoisting the Grey Cup. In 1981, the 5-11 Rough Riders were a surprise to win the East. In the Grey Cup, they were given no chance against the 3-time defending champion Edmonton Eskimos. But with J.C. Watts at quarterback, Ottawa stormed to a 20-1 halftime lead.
We came out really fired up because everybody expected us to be, we were like 25-point underdogs. You can go to a bookie and get 25 points on the game, but the team came fired up, and we took a commanding lead in the football game.
I can certainly remember the ecstatic Eastern crowd when we were winning 20-1 at halftime, and we shouldn't have showed up for the second half.
Edmonton quarterback Warren Moon shook off a miserable first half with a masterful second. While the Eskimos were suddenly putting points on the board, the Rough Riders began to crumble under the pressure. With 3 seconds on the clock, the game remained tied when a Dave Cutler field goal ended Ottawa's dreams of Grey Cup victory.
That was a very disappointing loss because our guys played so hard and we did so many things well, and it just wasn't meant to be that year. But it was a heck of a Grey Cup game.
Although no one knew it at the time, the 1981 loss would be the Ottawa Rough Riders' last trip to the Grey Cup. Over the next 15 years, the team saw little success. Changes in ownership, mismanagement, and poor on-field performances took a toll on the once proud franchise. And by the close of the 1996 season, the Rough Riders had played their final game in Ottawa.
The biggest surprise to me was when Ottawa lost its franchise. That was shocking to me. And yet, I don't blame the fans. The fans were always there. They wanted football. And to me, it wasn't the fan base that caused the loss of the franchise.
When the Rough Riders left town, It was because they had bad ownership, one bad owner after another who hired one coach who couldn't get it done, and the player exchange was absolutely incredible. But even to the very end, even at the very end of the Rough Rider era, there were still enthusiastic fans in the stand.
In 2002, die-hard fans celebrated the return of the game to the nation's capital. The arrival of the Renegades relit the torch of Ottawa football. And as their colors honor the past, the team builds for the future. The continued tradition of the CFL in Ottawa.
Ottawa's a great football town. Tremendous enthusiasm. Everybody's happy. Football's back in Ottawa, whether it's called the Rough Riders or the Renegade. Everybody is happy.
I was so glad that there's football back in the capital. When I went to that opening game of the Renegades, I mean, it was just breathtaking to see that place full and to see from the opening kickoff to the end of that game, those fans were just up, way up here throughout that entire 2.5 hours. And to me, the culture is there. They love their football, and I know they will always support a football team. I played for one head coach, and that was Frank Clare for the full 12 years, and not a lot of people can say that they played with one coach. And Frank Clare, there were a lot of stories about him, the absent-minded professor they used to call him, and that's a good definition of Frank. Frank forgot a lot of things, but a great technician when you're preparing to play football. But his one penchant was he couldn't remember football players' names. He would not remember Garney Henley's name. He'd talk about number 26, or he'd talk about number 10, Bernie Filoni, or number 61. He would never call them by name. Even the teams we played against a lot in the East. And in fact, he'd call me number 12 at times. We'd be in a meeting and it'd be number 12. It wouldn't be like Russ Jackson or anything like that. He just didn't have a penchant for remembering names. And the one true story is when Don Southern came to Ottawa from Hamilton and was becoming our field goal kicker when Mo Racine had been our field goal kicker for a long time, and Mo wanted to step down from doing that. We got Don Southern, and during the first game, we're about to kick our first field goal, and Frank Clare's on the sideline, as the story's told to me, saying, "Come on, I want it. Where's that? Where's that?" And then finally, he couldn't remember a name, and he didn't know what number he was wearing. He says, "Get that Oski Wee Wee guy in there. We got to try a field goal." And Frank couldn't remember his name, even though he came to us that week and we played against him for years. Just the way Frank was.
One of the most interesting experiences going back, my first year in Ottawa, about 3 weeks into the season, I was having great luck running on those sweeps and knocking a lot of those young Canadian boys. As I said, some of those Canadian boys just they really couldn't defend themselves well enough, and I'd turn the corner and what we used to call in Oklahoma cruiser blocks. With a full head of steam, I'd hit some of those young guys, and I think I knocked out 3 guys in the first 2 weeks, just exploding into them, turning the corner. And so I thought I was doing pretty well, but in those days, there were only 8 Americans on a team. So you had to not only beat the linemen out, you had to beat some backs and stuff out. You didn't know who they were going to keep, and it really ended up where you're stronger. If you had stronger Canadians at a position, you could have an American guy there and he wouldn't make it because they could only have 8. But anyway, about the third week I was there, it was about 5 or 6 days before our inter-squad game, and I was called into the coach's office after practice. And I thought, oh my God, don't tell me. I really thought that maybe I was going to be released. And Clem Crow was sitting there, and he looked at me, sit down there, boy. And I said, yes, sir. What? Well, he said, I've been in coaching for over 30 years, and he says I've never had to do this before. He says I'm a little bit befuddled. He said I don't know how to approach this, but he says you're going to have to help me. And I said, yes, sir. I'll do whatever you want. He says, son, he said, can you lay off for the next few practice? I said, what do you mean lay off? He said, just take it easy. Come around that corner, and he says, if you got somebody lined up, he says, trip or do anything, but he says, we can't afford to lose any more players. We've got to have 40 players. He said, we've got to have 2 teams to run an inter-squad game. And he says, the way you're going, he says, I'm not going to have enough guys to put on the field. So I said, okay, coach, whatever you want me to do. So I thought that was kind of unique to Canadian football and to that era, that we just didn't have the bodies to go around, you know. Plus the fact that I'd got some real good hits coming around that corner.
And when I was drafted by Ottawa, it was sort of a surprise in a way. I had decided I was definitely going to Teachers College, and in those days there was no summer school. You had to go a full year at Teachers College, and the only place you could go in Eastern Ontario was Toronto. So I was caught between a rock and a hard spot here, being drafted by Ottawa. They wanted me to go and sign a contract and go there, and yet I wanted to go to Ontario College of Education in Toronto starting in September. And so when I met with Frank Clare, whom I sort of negotiated with in Toronto, we talked over the entire situation, and we sort of talked about a salary, a bonus, which was unheard of for a Canadian player in those days, and also that I wanted to go to school. And Frank was a little, he gave you that look of his and a little apprehensive about all of this and schooling and a rookie coming in and so on. And about a week after I talked to him initially, they phoned me and said, well, I'll meet you in Toronto. We were playing a basketball game against MAC basketball, was playing in the big league, and we were playing Toronto varsity in Toronto. He said, I'll meet you. And we had a dinner together prior to the basketball game. And we came to an agreement on the contract. And I really think to this day that the reason Frank agreed to it was he didn't really think Russ Jackson was going to be an integral part of the Ottawa Rough Riders in 1958. So what I sort of wanted in terms of going to school would be acceptable. And I signed for a $4,500 base contract, which was big in those days. I got a $500 bonus, which was, again, unheard of, getting a bonus. And I got a plane ticket on the old TransCanada Airlines, paid for by Ottawa, back and forth from Ottawa to Toronto, as often as I needed to go back and forth to go to school, which was a couple of times a week. So I thought I did quite well, especially when I talked to some of the guys I knew who were young Canadian kids playing in Hamilton. And the contract was great as far as I was concerned. I was making next year I made about the same amount teaching, so I doubled my salary once I got into the education business. But it was, I think Frank agreed strictly because he didn't think Russ was going to be much of a factor as far as the Rough Riders were concerned.
In the '66 Grey Cup, when we walked out of that tunnel, I had my stomach I had butterflies like crazy, which I always did before every game. I wasn't as bad as some guys who threw up before games, but I had butterflies at every game. And '66 Grey Cup was excellent. There's a funny story behind the '66 Grey Cup, because in '66, Joe Poirier was a good friend of mine, number 17, and he said, look, once you get to the Grey Cup, and of course, this is my first Grey Cup, he said, Frank Clare doesn't care if we win or lose, so you can do anything you want, you can party and all this stuff. And so that morning he said, well, aren't you gonna have a beer? So I had a couple beers in the morning, before a pregame meal, and of course I ended up getting 2 touchdowns in the game. And then after the game, and he came to me and said, why didn't you have 4 beers? So
in Ottawa, it was a true team on and off the field. When we played a football game, almost everybody would end up at Sammy Kaufman's Belle Claire on Queen Street. And even if you had family in the city, you'd show up for a beer just to be there, win or lose, and then so you might be going out to dinner with your family. Or somebody would be having a party, and you would be at the party. You would be there. You'd show up at the party. Everybody was invited. There weren't little cliques here and cliques there that the Americans would get together, or the Canadians would get together, or the black guys would get together with their party. Everybody came. Everybody was a part of it. And that, to me, was one of the reasons we had so much success. I think teams that didn't have that in those days, and you hear rumors about other teams that weren't that way, but I was involved with that team in Ottawa, and it was fun. Everybody had fun. It's a small city. If you stepped out at night, a group of you, Frank knew the next day that you had been out on the town, and we just knew we were going to run a lot more the next day. But it was fun. It was something you had to be a part of. And I've often talked about that group of players. A lot of them played almost that whole decade in Ottawa. They were true family. You knew as much about them as you did about your own brothers and sisters, and sometimes even more.
The black quarterback issue during my era was very big. I had an opportunity, as I said before, I was recruited by a lot of schools in the South. And one school in particular, Alabama, recruited me very hard, and I had a meeting with Coach Bear Bryant. And to this day, I respect him very much for what he did, because he didn't have to do that. Coach Bryant could have told me anything. He could have told me, son, if you come to Alabama, you can play quarterback, and we'll be glad to have you. And then when I got there, it changed his mind, and who are they going to believe, a 17-year-old kid from Huntsville, Alabama, or the legendary Bear Bryant? But he didn't do that. He took me aside and he said, Condridge, we really want you to come here, but I don't think we're ready for a black quarterback at the University of Alabama. So if you come here, you will not be able to play quarterback. And he told me, so at least I knew what I was dealing with.
At that particular time, unfortunately, that was kind of the stereotype that, black kids could not be leaders. They could not think, make decisions, do all those type of things, and we were good athletes, so sometimes we got penalized for being good athletes, where they put us at the skill positions like defensive back and receiver, in places where your skills became an asset to you. But as you look today, you need a great athlete to play the quarterback position, and I think that same thing was true back then. They just didn't know it.
Going to Tennessee, one of Bear Bryant's former players, Bill Battle, who was my coach, said to me, Condridge, if you're the best quarterback on the field, you can play quarterback at Tennessee. And that really made the decision for me, because I wanted to play quarterback. And it was an issue, and it was something. I was the first black quarterback in the Southeastern Conference. And in 1971, so that would have been 1972, I thought that was a big deal. I never thought of myself as a pioneer or somebody, like Martin Luther King, that I was walking around paving the way. I just wanted to play football, and I had about 11 other guys on that other side of the ball that I needed to worry about. And it was a big media deal for a year, and after that, it kind of died down. But when I came to Canada, I found out where all the black quarterbacks were. Jimmy Jones, Chuck Ely, and I ended up, J.C. Watts. A lot of us were here.
If you're that successful as a quarterback, you should be able to play the game, but he wasn't given that opportunity in the United States. So I had tremendous amount of respect for those guys, that they didn't give up. They came up here and they made a career for themselves, and long careers. And I always felt like if things didn't work out for me in the National Football League, then I knew I had somewhere else I could go where I'd be wanted.
It was not an issue in Canada. You could either play or you couldn't.
I have to tell you a little story. In 1978, I hadn't caught a touchdown for about 5 games into the season. And I remember saying to Connie, which was his nickname, I said, Con, if you could throw me a touchdown today, I'll get a fro. And so sure enough, he throws me a touchdown pass. And there I am in the chair for 3 hours getting a permanent. And in my 1978 Shenley Awards picture, you can see me with my protective hair and my pick. I didn't get any concussions that year because of my permed hair. That was funny.
I think that throughout my entire life, I was competitive. I don't care whether I was playing a game of Tiddlywinks or a game of gin or playing in a Grey Cup game. To me, it was important to win. It was important to win because of the competitive nature. Some people might say, well, you're saying it's important to win, and you've preached to a lot of young kids throughout your career and so on in high school that wasn't the only thing, and it isn't the only thing. I know that I've learned a great deal from losing seasons at university level where we lost every game. I think I learned probably as much that year as I did in seasons where we won every game. So that I'm not saying that the winning is the only thing, but if you're a competitor, if you're going to be competitive, that's what you're out there to do. You're not out there to float along and accept mediocrity, especially from yourself. That was the one person I always had to satisfy was Russ Jackson, whether it was in the lesson I taught to those kids in mathematics or whether it was playing in a football game. I had to walk away from either of those situations and say, I did the best I could. That's competitiveness to me, and I believe you've got to have it to be successful in anything, business world, sports, or anything.
I'm sure everybody has a Frank Clair story. Mine is pretty good. When my agent and I, Mike Carroll, go into Frank's office, and we had an offer on the table with the New England Patriots, but I did not want to play defensive back, and I'd gone through that whole black quarterback deal in college for 4 years, and I just wasn't going to put up with that anymore. I wanted to play quarterback because that's the position I played. And we were trying to negotiate a little bit and act as if we were interested, but I had no intentions of going to New England because playing cornerback there meant you had to take on John Hanna every day at practice. He's a big guard, and he was a big-time player. So we go to Ottawa, and we're kind of tongue-in-cheek. Well, we've got this order. We've got an offer in New England, and we're negotiating. So we come up to Frank and say, well, I'll tell you what we'll do. If it's $25,000, we want $25,000 in U.S. dollars. And Frank Clair just gets up and starts whirling around. He says, what do you want that money for? It's all the same color. Look at this Canadian stuff. It's different colors. You know what you got. And I'm looking at my agent going, does he really think we're going to fall for that? But that was Frank. He thought that, and at the time, instead of telling us the real story that we found out later, the Canadian dollar was worth more than the American dollar at the time. He didn't think that was important. He just thought the colors of the money was the thing that I'd be impressed with, and that was Frank.
'76 was indeed a dark day in Saskatchewan. There were house parties everywhere, watching the Saskatchewan Roughriders play the Ottawa Roughriders in the Grey Cup. And I was a Saskatchewan Roughriders fan, green and white through and through then. We were at a house party, as I think the whole province was. Everyone who wasn't attending the game thought we had the game in the bag. And all we yelled that last play was, watch Gabriel. Everyone at the house party was yelling, watch Gabriel. They're going to throw to Gabriel. Clemens is going to throw to Tony Gabriel.
To this day, when I see the replay of the Grey Cup catch of '76 in Toronto, I am amazed. It's like I'm detached from the picture. And every time I'm seeing that ball coming down to this number 77, trying to look at myself as a younger self, it's with the thought that, oh no, this time I'm going to drop it. But thank God I've got that Grey Cup ring from '76 to prove that I didn't drop it and that they can't take it away from me.
There wasn't a noise in the house for, I bet, 15 minutes. just sat there, couldn't believe that they let Tony Gabriel free, and they beat the Saskatchewan Roughriders. The Ottawa Roughriders won that game. Shouldn't have happened.
Condredge Holloway was one of the toughest guys I ever met, too. First time I ever met Condredge Holloway, we were going into a place in Ottawa, and I was with Tom Clements, and I told him I wanted to meet Condredge. So, and this is in 1980, so we're going to Ottawa. Tommy introduces me to him. He grabs my hand, and he goes, "Ben Zambiazzi." He grabs my hand, and then Coco butts me in the head. Just reached over and pounds me with his head on my head. He goes, "Hell of a linebacker." Bang, cuts me open. He said, that was a Tennessee greeting, Coco butt. Him and Ray Nettles used to do it. And I just thought, Jesus Christ, I wasn't really prepared for that, Connie.
It's funny looking back through the years that I had, 7 years that I had with the Ottawa Roughriders. It was the most desired, what do you call it, rivalry between Montreal Alouettes and ourselves, but also particularly for Tony Gabriel and Peter Della Riva.
Tony and I started off in junior football together in Burlington the one year we played in '66, and Tony went on to Syracuse in a scholarship, and I played 1 year senior football in Montreal, and then we ended up meeting in the league.
You see, in practice, I had to wear number 74, and if I dropped one in practice, they say, "Hey, Peter would have caught that." And then in games, it was always trying to individually contribute, but be better than Peter Della Riva. And he was one of the finest tight ends in the CFL, as you know.
Myself as a player and as a person, I respected everybody. It's just that, I don't know, I always ran off the field after every game. I never shook hands or anything. I didn't stay on the field. I couldn't see that, going there being buddies, and I knew I had to play him again somewhere down the line. If I happened to go by him and he was there, I'd say, "Nice game," or he'd shake hands, and I'd keep on going. My last season, 1981, we were playing Ottawa. It was the last game of the season before the playoffs, and we're practicing before the game, our half of the field, and all of a sudden, a guy grabs me by the arm, and here was Tony. He came over to our side of the field, and he says, "Pete," he says, "I know you run off the field after every game," he says, "but this is my last game," he says, "my last year, like you. I know you're retiring." And so I didn't know you were retiring. He said, "Yeah," he said, "I'm not, this is my last year. I got a photographer ready," he said. After the game, he says, "I want to get a picture of you and I," he says, and he says, "So don't go in," he says, I said, okay. So we played the game, and after the game, I don't know if I've forgotten about it or whatever. I'm just used to accustomed to doing what I always do, and I started running off the field, and Tony came and yelled at me and grabbed me and got a hold of me and had a photographer there, and we had a picture of him and I together, and I'm glad he did. So it was kind of neat, and I kind of really cherish that picture now.
I've talked to some of my players now that come out, and they said, "Well, Coach Holloway, if I don't make it in the NFL, you think you can get me to in the Canadian Football League?" I said, "Son, let me ask you something. If you can't throw the out on this small field, what makes you think you can throw it on the larger field?" He goes, "What are you talking about?" I said, "The field's a little wider, and it's a little longer. And if you're on the hash mark and throwing out to the field in Canada, that's a long ways. You better have a better arm than you had here. So don't think that because it's in Canada it's an inferior game. That's not the case. And there's a lot of good football players in Canada, and don't ever degrade my my league and my livelihood." I get on a pedestal sometimes about that because these kids don't know. They just think that the CFL is a secondary place. I tell them all the time, I say, "Guys, let me tell you something. There's any team in Canada will play the Miami Dolphins tomorrow if we can implement one rule, and it'll be fair." And they said, "Well, what do you mean? Do you want a longer field? You want the Canadian ball? What do you want? I said, we want the nationality rule. You let us do that, and we'll play Miami tomorrow. He says, what do you mean? Well, in my time, it's 1915. I said, well, we'll have 15 Americans, you have 15 Americans. We'll have 19 Canadians, you have 19 of any other nationality you can find other than American, and we'll play you. And they looked at me and they go, well, where are we going to find them? I said, I don't know, but we find them in Canada. You find them and we'll play you. And then they look at me and they go, are those really the rules? I said, yeah. So it's a different game. And all the players are good, but we've got a nationality problem that we deal with. It's not a problem, it just makes the game better. So I'll get off my pedestal.
Bravo! Yeah, but we need more.
Since 1909, Ottawa has challenged for the Grey Cup and experienced the euphoria of capturing the national title 9 times. In the 1951 Grey Cup game, the Ottawa Roughriders battled the Saskatchewan Roughriders at Toronto's Varsity Stadium. Ottawa quarterback Tom O'Malley directed the offense. The Eastern Riders recorded 3 major scores on touchdowns by Benny McDonnell, Elton Baldwin, and Pete Carpuck. Going into the fourth quarter, Ottawa was ahead 20-2. Despite the huge deficit, the Western Riders would not go quietly as their quarterback Glenn Dobbs manufactured a pair of touchdown drives to put them within 6 points. But the Ottawa defense held their ground. Tom O'Malley closed out the scoring with a single point in a 21-14 Grey Cup victory over the Saskatchewan Roughriders. In 1960, the Ottawa Roughriders made it back to the Grey Cup game for the first time since 1951. Their opposition was the Western champion Edmonton Eskimos. To achieve victory, the Roughriders had to find a way to stop rushing quarterback Jackie Parker. Lou Bruce fought through adversity as he played on an injured knee and managed to contain Parker. On special teams, Ottawa's Ron Stewart electrified the crowd at Empire Stadium with spectacular punt returns. Ottawa quarterback Russ Jackson did a masterful job running the offense. With the ball on Edmonton's 32-yard line, Jackson bootlegged a perfect fake. While most of the Ottawa backs ran to the right, Jackson drifted to the left and connected with Bill Sawalski for a touchdown. The pivotal moment of the game occurred in the fourth quarter when Edmonton's Joe Bob Smith fumbled a Jim Conroy punt on the Eskimo 2-yard line after being crunched by Jim Reynolds and Lou Bruce. The loose ball was picked up by veteran Kay Vaughn, who would score the first touchdown of his career in a 16-6 Grey Cup victory over the Edmonton Eskimos. The 1968 Grey Cup game was a showdown between the Ottawa Roughriders and Calgary Stampeders at Toronto's CNE Stadium. After the first half, the Roughriders were down 14-4. The momentum would shift in the third quarter when Ottawa's Jim Kane tackled Calgary's Ron Stewart as he attempted to punt the ball. The play inspired the Roughriders as Russ Jackson gutted the offense down the field and capped off the drive with a 1-yard plunge that made the score 14-11. Early in the fourth quarter, Ottawa would take the lead. Jackson pitched the ball to running back Vic Washington. He fumbled, but managed to recover it as the ball magically bounced back into his hands. Thanks to a key block by Tom Benyon, Washington found daylight and burst down the sideline, outrunning Jerry Keeling for an 80-yard touchdown. Then Ottawa took advantage of a blocked Calgary field goal attempt. Jackson marched the Roughriders down to the Stampeder 40-yard line. It was there he called on Margene Atkins to head for the end zone. Atkins made no mistake as he delivered the winning points in a 24-21 Grey Cup victory over the Calgary Stampeders. The 1969 Grey Cup game saw the Ottawa Roughriders take on the Saskatchewan Roughriders. It would be the final game in Russ Jackson's celebrated career, and he went out in a blaze of glory. Jackson began cautiously. and by the second quarter, he was unstoppable. His mixture of plays kept the Saskatchewan defense guessing. Jackson finished the game with 4 touchdown passes. The final result was a convincing 29-11 Grey Cup victory over the Saskatchewan Roughriders. It was the perfect ending to the coaching career of Frank Clair and the greatest Canadian quarterback of all time, Russ Jackson. The 1973 Grey Cup game at Toronto's CNE Stadium featured the Ottawa Roughriders and Edmonton Eskimos. The Roughriders' defense thrived on brutality. They were known as the Capital Punishment Gang. Edmonton quarterback Tom Wilkinson was charged in the first offense. Wayne Smith violently crushed Wilkinson into the turf to force him out of the game. At the half, the Roughriders had taken the lead on a Jerry Organ field goal. As the game wore on, Edmonton struggled and Ottawa gained momentum. Charles Brandon played like a warrior. His timely blocks provided holes for running backs Art Green and Jim Evanson. He also supplied great pass protection for quarterback Rick Casada. On defense, Brandon was just as consistent by accounting for the majority of tackles that halted the Edmonton ground attack. The Ottawa Roughriders emerged victorious with a 22-18 victory over the Edmonton Eskimos, and for veteran Mo Racine, one more chance to hoist the Grey Cup. At the 1976 Grey Cup game, the Ottawa Roughriders clashed with the Saskatchewan Roughriders. Leading the way for Ottawa was quarterback Tom Clements. At the helm for the Western Riders was future Hall of Famer Ron Lancaster, who would be playing in his final Grey Cup game. Ottawa's quarterback Tom Clements was playing in his first Grey Cup game. Clements' ability to operate under pressure inspired his teammates. Saskatchewan had a 10-point lead in the third quarter. 2 field goals by Jerry Organ put them within 4 points of Saskatchewan. Timing is the essence of everything, and Tom Clements used the remaining time on the clock to produce a dramatic ending. On the final offensive series, Tom Clements threw his last 2 passes to a powerful tight end by the name of Tony Gabriel. The second pass completion was the most famous of all and will forever be known as the catch. Gabriel managed to charge off the line untouched, and Clements knew where to find him. Saskatchewan could only watch as Gabriel caught the game-winning touchdown. The Ottawa Roughriders were Grey Cup champions with a 23-20 victory over the Saskatchewan Roughriders. At the 1981 Grey Cup, the Ottawa Roughriders faced the defending Grey Cup champion, Edmonton Eskimos. Ottawa finished the season with a 5-11 record, and many considered this contest as the biggest mismatch of all time. It turned out to be the exact opposite, as the Roughriders surprised the Eskimos and the rest of the country. Ottawa quarterback J.C. Watts had the offense firing on all cylinders as they dominated with a 20-1 lead at the half. In the second half, the Eskimos came alive. Tony Gabriel could run no more as he limped off the line of scrimmage to receive a pass from J.C. Watts. Victory was slipping from their grasp, but the Ottawa Roughriders continued to put up a brave fight before losing 26-23 to the Edmonton Eskimos. As the Eskimos celebrated, J.C. Watts dropped to his knees in exhaustion and devastation. But it would not be in vain, as the Ottawa Roughriders won respect. The Ottawa Roughriders are no more, but not forgotten. Today, it's the Ottawa Renegades building their own tradition as they strive to become Grey Cup champions. Canadian football is a magic show. It is a game that has grabbed our nation by the heart. This is the story of CFL Traditions, a 5-hour television special that showcases the history and heroes of Canadian football. Live the game's greatest moments through the eyes and hearts of its most celebrated legends. Now available on DVD and VHS, CFL Traditions is the ultimate collector's edition. Each of the 9 franchises is featured in their own special team edition release. 9 teams, 9 titles, available in stores everywhere.
Canadian football is something I was brought up on. I love the game because it's quick. It has always allowed the quarterback to be able to run with the ball, and I thoroughly enjoyed that challenge.
In the Canadian League, there's no such thing as being a rookie. You're a contributor or you're not, or else you don't make it.
The excitement in the game, in a Canadian football game, with the 3 downs, with the wider field, with the kick return, it may be the best game in the world to watch on television.
It's so fast, it's so wide open, and I think it speaks to my personality. It's sort of a living on the edge type of football game.
It's exciting. You're never out of a ball game in the Canadian Football League. And as a quarterback, that's all you want is a chance. You want to have the ball in your hands with 1 minute to play and give your team a chance to win the ball game.
It was an opportunity that I was being given that I didn't see happening in my own country. And I really weighed the pros and cons of going to Canada or staying in the United States, and I chose to go to Canada because they were giving me a realistic opportunity to play the game that I loved.
I came up just with the attitude that I was going to learn about the CFL, put my best foot forward. Whatever it took, I was going to get the job done, and anything else was not acceptable.
I wanted to come play. And in the NFL, they would have just used me for, okay, for this and for that. And in Edmonton, I knew I had a chance to do what I wanted to do and play the game.
It put the fun back in football for me. It enabled me to go back out, just be an athlete, play football, and enjoy it. And I'll be forever grateful for that.
The Canadian Football League is arguably the most significant cultural institution in the country as it relates to bringing cities across the country together.
It's the one thing, the one professional sport that we have left that we can say is purely Canadian. It's the only one.